juggling three screens. Apologies to the online folks. It isn't the recording, and all you missed was my background and biography. Um, but again, this density, this geography, the intersection, right, of coastal land, the wild urban interface, the Santa Ana winds, all of this brings complexity to the disaster response. And also it brings variability to there's been three floods, but in each flood, it's a different priority because of what has been impacted. And so while Ventura's got a lovely Mediterranean climate with its dry summers and mild winters, um, we need to take all of these other factors into account whenever disasters occur. And so, again, I'm an anthropologist by training, so I found it really useful as a new anthropologist to find published store a lot more detail about floods that have occurred in the past. And again, I think that's really important information. While everything we've heard today says we can't rely on the historical data, I think there are still lessons to be learned. They may not be as predictable, but I think some of our responses to that, some of our adaptations can still be brought forward with us, or we can say, hey, that used to be the solution. It's no longer the solution. So that kind of engagement is really important when we talk about building resiliency. And I don't have the answers. I'm here collecting a lot of information, working with folks to try to figure out how do we move on to the next step. Because at the end of the day, it's not just about numbers, it's also about taking action, as we've talked about. And I also just wanted to share with you guys something that both makes me feel great, but also freaks me out a little bit. It's the average rainfall to date. So what you have at the 42% average is that was last year's total rainfall was 42% of the expected range. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but basically by the first quarter of the year, when the fires came, we were not even close, right? Because even at the end of the year, we only achieved 44% in Ventura County. This year alone, in the like 3 or 4 months, because the rain season starts in October, um, on average, Ventura County has already achieved 106% of the annual rainfall, and that's on average. I've also included ranges, and so Lake Sherwood has actually the lowest amount, lowest percentage of annual rainfall at the moment, and they're at 86.7%. And so that's still quite high considering we're still in the first third of the year. And I know from some other estimates that they're predicting we're going to have an El Nino year. And so I can't imagine how much more rain we're going to get throughout this rest of this year, considering where we're already at. And so while this is great because then we're quite wet, and as I think lots of the presenters have mentioned today, that circumstance is actually really important for and it's part of the reason why there's currently not a fire. But what concerns me is that in 2 years, if this doesn't continue or like meet some sort of metric, at least 50 to 40, 100% again, we could be back in the same situation with, again, a high risk for fire. And so these are things I think about. But again, I know as a farmer, this might not be what you're thinking about right now. You're like, it rained right now, it's gonna dry up. I got my season to get through, and then we'll see what happens at the end. But I think resiliency is really important to think about how all the pieces play together, and again, to figure out priorities. I thought about showing you guys more of the disasters, but I think the farmer panel, I knew they were going to do it. We asked that question to the farmer panel. What were the disasters that stood out most to them? Because in no report do we get these very specific stories about there was a freeze, but what did that mean and for whom? And so that gets really hard to capture on a single data point or chart like this one. And so NOAA has a couple of charts that are not currently be updated, and they didn't finish 24 and 25 because they're on pause. But this is the United States natural disasters across the last, I think, 40 years it is. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean, I think like Daniel mentioned this morning, that we're having more climatic events, but they are getting more expensive. That economic angle is really important because again, and reasons why it gets more expensive is simply because of geography. Some of it has to do with land, right? What is land coded for? What are folks doing? Inputs are also just more expensive. And so even if you adjust for inflation, disasters are still really expensive. And I mean, the really interesting thing here is that NOAA's data set says they only included $1 billion disasters that incurred $1 billion and above in estimated damages. They didn't include anything under that, and it was still like 80%. of disasters. And so very few of them cost us very little. They all cost a whole lot now. And this is the same thing that's true for California. I always find this chart really interesting because that dip is from before I joined ANR. And once I joined ANR, I told folks I'm not worried about job security because I'm the disaster person and they just keep coming. And so when you look at these two charts side by side, there's a lot of data involved in them and there's some controversy about what this actually means. But I think to see the trend that the disasters are more expensive is part of the reason why I continue to have a job. How do we reduce these expenses and these losses? Because long-term viability means we have to get this somewhat under control. And so again, when I started working with the Fresno Small Farms team in 21, we were actually at the end of the pandemic-ish. We were also at the beginning of a second drought in a historic drought in 10 years, the second historic drought in 10 years to occur. And so a lot of folks are like, well, what is the cost of these two disasters that you're handling? And I was like, we never even did a like cost analysis because at the end of the day, the things I did and the impacts of these like issues there were more issues than costs. And so things like in the pandemic, we were concerned with supply chain challenges for farmers, labor shortages, market disruptions. There were a lot of new regulatory procedures and information, and mental health became a really serious kind of challenge. And so it wasn't just about dollars that people were losing, it was also about providing additional services so they could continue doing their business, continue figuring out what to do next. And when it came to drought, I mean, there was the objective crop loss, the fact that there wasn't as much water available. The water infrastructure we realized was really, really out of date. And if it hadn't been managed or maintained, it broke or it stopped working. And I had some folks survive the drought with their existing infrastructure. And then right after that, when the floods came, like their filters, which hadn't been checked in a while because they weren't pulling any water, these filters now needed to be cleaned because now they were getting 300% what they were expecting. And so that caused additional losses and impacts and delays. There's also increased pest pressure, which isn't necessarily linked to, again, hotter weather, but hotter weather, again, as Tapan mentioned, one more generation of this pest, it might just push you and tip you over. And again, Ben's panel brought together a lot of the regulatory challenges. And again, while we're trying to manage natural resources, how do we keep small farms and businesses in business while trying to attend to what happens further down the line? And again, I bring mental health up again because it was important to growers, it was important to researchers and community members, and access to mental health care. And so I wanted to show you guys this. It is what they call the disaster cycle. And so usually what we expect happens is a disaster shakes. And then we're really focused on response and recovery. And response and recovery should at some point, and usually they make folks think, hey, I need to think about prevention or what we call mitigation because you can't just say no more floods. It's never going to flood again. It's never going to get hot again. So then it becomes a question of mitigation. And once you have some of those measures in place, it makes you a little bit more prepared, right? So with heat, if you do regular heat illness training and you recognize the signs of heat sickness and you have all preventative measures in place, the goal is that in the next heat cycle, you're ready for it. But I think what the farmers have demonstrated today and what many of us know is that disasters can keep coming. And that's what we've been seeing happen frequently is before we can start thinking about this like really nice discrete cycle, we see many, many more disasters. And that's something that I saw in Fresno County. I see across the state pretty consistently that it makes it really hard to complete this like nice, neat circle because there are so many points that we start over, or do we stop what we're doing and start again? There's a lot of questions. And again, I don't have answers for that. But again, I'm here to support, here to figure out what things should be prioritized. We did a lot of education with growers after the drought and after the flood in Fresno County about, they're like, why do we need to dig reservoirs in the middle of a drought again? I'm like, because when you don't have them when it floods, you can't store any water. And if you wait until the water comes, then you can't store it. And so again, the prioritization has a little bit to do with what's happening immediately, that knee-jerk response and reminder, oh yeah, that's a priority. But also sometimes this stuff just takes a while. You don't dig reservoirs like overnight. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about disaster resiliency, which again, I think the panel did a much better job of doing and explaining in person. But it's defined as the ability of individuals and communities to adapt to, respond to, and recover from hazards, shocks, or stresses. Um, and I think the really important, and again, it takes place largely in the prevention and preparedness section, whereas first responders handle a lot of the response and short-term recovery. Long-term recovery and the planning and resiliency comes back to local communities, which is why I think cooperative extension started my position as a way to invest in that for growers as well as community members. And the important thing about resiliency is that it reflects ongoing and joint effort. And again, so no one should feel like they have to do it alone. No one should be doing it in isolation. And again, I think it happens at multiple stages. And so one of the goals of this afternoon's panels and presentations is that when we put this together, we were like, wow, we're just doom and gloom all morning. It's all data and like data sets and charts and graphs. How can we be helpful rather than just laying it out there? And so this afternoon is geared more towards resources and both people and programs and finances, as well as long-term planning. And so I won't talk about a lot of those things since a lot of our speakers are going to cover those things, but I wanted to preface their presentations with that. And then I'm going to leave you guys with a few resources. Again, I'm a resource. I started the UCANR disaster blog to try to like more methodically and slowly in smaller increments, like month by month, talk about preparedness. Like we can talk about how do you get prepared for an emergency. Like we can just, I'm like, let's just take a little bit of time and what goes in a kit. Because again, what's I think really interesting to me, and again, the folks who talked about regulations talk about this too. It happens in preparedness. Folks only see a fire. They only see a flood. They only see an earthquake. Then growers have binders for every regulatory burden. You don't necessarily need to have a backpack as well for every single incident. There are certain things that you'll need more in certain disasters, but the goal of the disaster blog is to kind of go into a little bit more detail, provide some examples of if you're like, I don't have that battery, or like, I don't use a cell phone. I prefer to use something else. What are the alternatives? And to kind of go in more detail, there's a lot of conflicting information, a lot of conflicting resources. And so the goal is the disaster blog is a place where folks can talk about these things. Or if somebody in the community is doing a really great job at providing a really simple example of something that sounds really complicated, we'll talk about it there. And then in Ventura County, readyventuracounty.gov, I think it is a really important site if you don't know about it. And again, you can sign up for VC alerts there, as well as they have some templates for family emergency plans. I do this with my family every year, and they make me the person who is in charge of their emergency plan, but it's kind of rough because I'm 2 hours away. But we go through it once a year where we designate, okay, if these things happen, what is the call log or where's the tree? Where are you supposed to meet? Where are all of our resources? And so it's really important to have these plans in place for both families, communities, workplaces. I know we have in our office spaces, plans in place as well, but also farms. And that's, I think, one of the hardest adaptations is to farms. Who needs to be involved? If you have questions, happy to answer those, to think with you through these things. And again, in Ventura County, the Sheriff's Office is responsible for the Office of Emergency Services. And so if you have questions around, a lot of growers actually, OES love us when you tell them, hey, I have these things on my farm. So in case of a power outage, I have a generator. And I might activate that. So again, communicating this with the chain of command at your local Office of Emergency Service is really important to basically let them know what your priorities are and your resources are in case your farm is in the direct line of something. Additional resources, I mean, again, we don't always trigger a FEMA disaster assistance program, but again, never hurts to kind of look. The California Department of Food and Ag's California Underserved Small Producers Program is an extreme weather grant for farms under 400,000 or for dairy farms under 1 million for any disasters, natural disasters from 2017 to the present. It's only $25,000, which is not $20,000 per year. It's not a lot, but it does help. Smaller farms with smaller issues. That funding ends soon, and we're hoping to have another conversation with the governor about what do we need next after extreme weather, because that grant used to just cover COVID losses, and then it included drought and now extreme weather. The Ventura Regional Fire Safe Council has added increased capacity for home wildfire assessments, and those are free. UCNR has a very specific fire network farm and rancher resource for if you're going to walk through your farm and assess your risk. Again, if it's not sufficient with the VRF, the Ventura Fire Safe Council, I think the fire network's list and guideline is relatively simple and easy to follow. And again, you don't have to do these things alone. Part of my position is to be able to walk with you guys through these things. If you're like, hey, confused, what do we do? And so those are the resources for me. We're going to hold any questions because I think what's really great about the next like line of speakers is we're all talking about different resources.